welcome to our first Bronx Talk series. My name is Adam Shapiro. I'm a 2009 fellow, and really excited about this. This is our, as I said, our first one. So if something goes wrong, thank you for bearing with us. And this is a really great panel to start off. And I think what we're trying to do in this series, a lot of what we want to do is recreate what I think most of us love about Bronfman, and that is getting incredible perspective from people who have deep understanding, asking difficult questions, thinking through difficult ideas, and really recreating that personal community, which is that pluralistic community, which is one thing when it happens behind a keyboard, but hopefully it takes on a different dimension when we do it together face to face, or as close as this is to face-to-face. So that's some of what we're hoping to achieve today. It's a really, obviously a transformational moment in the country, and the way in which law enforcement and the criminal justice system is broken is just very apparent now to anyone who's paying attention. But hopefully what we'll do today is kind of zoom out and look at the broader context behind that, and really think about the ways that we can reimagine what criminal justice could look like. So with that, the other thing is that, obviously there are a lot of amazing alumni on this call who easily could have been part of the panel, and who certainly, who are either professionally working or activists working in the space. So really would love for this to be a conversation as much as possible with all of you. So if at any point when any of our panelists are talking, if you have a question, there should be a participant that you can find titled questions, I believe, and that would be the best place to put your questions. And then I'll call on you and hopefully get you to jump in and ask your question to whichever panelist. So with that, I'll introduce our panelists. Elliot Mamet is a 2010 fellow, currently a Ph.D. candidate in political science at Duke University, whose research focuses on the prison and democratic politics. Hey, Elliot. Hi. And Lara Kislinger is a 1998 fellow and has been a public defender in Los Angeles County for 13 years. She has represented clients in all types of misdemeanor, felony, and juvenile cases, including over 60 trials. Thanks for joining us, Lara. And Becki Marcus is a 2015 fellow. She graduated from Brown with a bachelor's in public policy. She's worked at the Women's Community Justice Association, the formerly incarcerated Union of Rhode Island, and the Nonviolence Institute. And she's now a consultant to the Providence Student Union. Hi, Becki.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's jump in. And obviously this moment, we're seeing this kind of popular democratic uprising that's sort of contesting prison and law enforcement. So I'm wondering, Elliot, if you can kind of, broaden that out for us and talk to us a little bit about that struggle between democratic politics on one hand and incarceration on the other.
Sure, I'm happy to. And first, let me just thank Adam for organizing this, and Becki and everyone, Aaron and Panina and everyone at Bronfman for organizing these great talks. And it's really nice to see so many faces, some I know and some I don't. Adam, you asked about democracy and incarceration. So I'm researching that topic for my dissertation. And my research looks at this phenomena that oftentimes there's increased democratic participation. At the same time, there's an increase of incarceration. And I'm looking at it from the lens of the history of political thought, and thinking about how are those ideas connected between democratic self-rule on the one hand and incarceration on the other. I'm very interested in this phenomena. And like, even I live in Durham, North Carolina, and in the middle of downtown is a jail that was authorized by democratically elected county commissioners. People are there for violating democratically enacted law, but in all sorts of ways they can't participate in democratic politics. They can't vote, they can't organize in many ways, they can't hold elected office. So that's what I'm interested in. how democracy and the prison are related.
So that's helpful. And so when we think about these sort of, these killings of whether it's George Floyd or Rayshard Brooks, there is a longer dark history behind these individual instances that sort of, shocked some people who haven't been, necessarily paying attention. So what would you point out to help make sense of these isolated moments and tell a larger historical story about racism and criminal justice?
Before I answer that, can I just do
Sure.
a quick pitch, which is, I talked to Adam a little bit about this, but he is a producer on a podcast called Backstory, which has a lot of good episodes on race and criminal justice that I highly recommend to everyone.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the shout-out.
Yes. So, I mean, I'll just say this briefly. We can get more into it in the discussion, but I mean, so I study, I'm interested in the history of the prison in the U.S. And as anyone who's seen Ava DuVernay's 13th knows, that topic has always been linked to race from its inception. And so I think different scholars have different things to say about this topic, but I mean, I think it's very clear the history of these events right now is long and is tied to race. So thinking about the move from slavery to Reconstruction and lynching up to Jim Crow and segregation to the prison, I think is a historical connection like that helps frame frame those current events.
So why don't we can you talk a little bit about sort of the history of policing itself and how it emerged as a way, what were the pre-Civil War sort of origins of that?
Yeah, sure. Criminal justice has gone through a lot of changes in the U.S. and one thing to emphasize is the prisons, or this idea that the prison is a sort of punitive or rehabilitative space, is by no means the norm, even in contexts and certainly in others. So I mean, in early America, there was not the same kind of prisons. You sort of see in the Jacksonian era an increase in incarceration, the increase in the construction of prisons. Alexis de Tocqueville comes here not to write Democracy in America, but to study American prisons. And you also see from that very beginning a reformist movement. So it's interesting to trace how the prison came with it a move to reform. And back then the reforms were solitary confinement, things like that. And then, going forward, again, my view is that it's always linked to race in some way. And you have like here in the South, chain gangs and all sorts of prison labor being used after the Civil War by African Americans to construct the landscape around us. And then for all sorts of reasons, which we can talk about, you have a boom in mass incarceration, certainly after Nixon, and on racial lines once again. So from my point of view, it's a racial story about the history of prisons and criminal justice in America.
And so how much was that that story, that war on drugs story, explicitly racialized at the time? Like how much was that tried to conceal, and how much of that was overt?
So it's a great question, and I'm interested in what, we have practitioners on the call and what everyone thinks about that from their own point of view. I can only answer it from an academic point of view, and I think scholars and historians and political scientists have various reasons for the spike in mass incarceration. So with obviously race at the center, but there's also people like Marie Gottschalk and Naomi Murakawa, whose work I recommend, talking about how liberals or reformers propose policies that increase mass incarceration, even looking at things like the prison reform movement as spiking a backlash, or the women's movement, the anti-rape movement, leading to increased sentences. So there's a lot of reasons there, and there's a lot to disentangle, but I think at the heart it was a story of sort of white politics, white political power. There's a political scientist named Bachelor Weaver who's coined the term front lash, meaning whites after the civil rights era sort of moved to reassert political power through mass incarceration, and I agree with that story, and but there's loads of different explanations there, which perhaps we can get into on the call.
Yeah, and how early, I guess, to sort of tie this up a little bit. How early do you start to see articulations of that problem, of the problem of somehow mass incarceration or law enforcement not representing democratic ideals? When does that start to be articulated, and what are some of the kind of important moments in that?
Yeah, I always think that in the American political tradition, the prison has been a place to put people who were thought of as outside of the bounds of popular rule. I don't think there was ever a time when that wasn't the case. I also think it's always been connected with notions of whiteness in various ways and in different manifestations. So I don't think there was ever a time, to answer your question, Adam, where that wasn't the case. And I mean, even it's certainly true today as well.
Okay, and so maybe we'll kind of circle back in a little bit and discuss, some more of the history of behind reform movements. But let me bring Lara into the conversation and get a real sense of how this sort of history plays out on the ground today. And Lara, in doing your work, I guess, what's it like to confront this on a regular basis, and how difficult is it to, let's say, try to hold police accountable for to try to hold police accountable for police misconduct?
Hi guys. So there's so many issues that this all raises, and let me say first that it's exciting and maybe hopeful that this feels like a moment when all of this stuff that we as public defenders see and take for granted, and frankly Black and brown people see and take for granted, is kind of becoming part of the popular discourse. And because if we're going to start with police officers, for instance, I would say the pervasiveness of misconduct and the difficulty of proving it up until now couldn't be overstated. I mean, as a public defender, anytime an interaction with my client began with a stop, either pulling someone over or stopping them on the street, I assumed that what was written in the police report was not true. And any time that I had a client coming in custody who had gotten the you-know-what beat out of them and was charged with resisting arrest, I also assumed that whatever was in the police report wasn't true. And this gets played out in hundreds, if not thousands, of conversations with clients, but it's really difficult in an individual case. And every once in a while, a police officer would screw up, right? Every once in a while, they'd write a report saying, I was walking down the street and I saw a female Black walking her bicycle, and I detained her for a stolen bicycle investigation. You'd be like, you did what? That's illegal. But what was surprising was not that went on. What was surprising was that it was written down. I have a colleague who was once a police officer and said, they called it testifying. There was a word for it. I kid you not. That what you do is whatever happens at the end, you then rewind and justify for, whatever the reasons are, getting dangerous people off the streets, the ends justify the means, right? But you have to wonder if the only thing this person is being charged with, who's Black and blue, is resisting arrest, what exactly were they being arrested for to begin with? And I'll tell you that the district attorneys always press charges, because as long as someone pleads to something, which they often do to get out of custody, which I'll circle back to, a civil suit is essentially impossible, right? Because you've just admitted you've done something wrong. Now, why might you plead to something when you didn't do anything? Well, to get out of jail, for one. And so this is where the problems with proving police misconduct are really connected with the bail issues, because so now we have the advent of body cameras, and I want to talk about those a little bit, because that has changed the landscape in some ways, and in some ways it has not at all. But I work in California, so I can only speak to California. But in California, there is no such thing as public records of police misconduct. In fact, up until a year or two ago, nothing was public. Now, pursuant to some Public Records Act requests, there are certain types of sustained misconduct, and only certain types, that you can actually get access to. But prior to that, if you had a case where your client was saying, these cops are lying, this is not what happened, how are you ever going to convince anyone of that? Well, it might be the case that this cop has a long history of lying, but you won't know that going in. Nobody's going to turn that over to you. And in fact, the only way to get it is through this process, a case called pitches. It's this process where you have to file a motion alleging specific facts in your case that provide a basis to think that this cop either used excessive force or lied. And then the police department gets lots of notice. So the whole process takes like a month or more to litigate. The judge will determine whether they think that there is a sufficient basis. Then in camera, we'll look at police records, only 5 years worth though. You can't look further than 5 years. So a judge will in camera take a look at the records and decide, you have no idea, right? Decide what they think is relevant and what isn't, and turn it over to you with a protective order saying you may not disclose it to the public or to anybody else in your office. So the process of getting this, and by the way, this is really specific. So you have to allege some kind of misconduct in your case. And if your case didn't involve use of force, you don't get any information about use of force, even if this is a cop who beats the crap out of everyone. And then there are things like racial bias, which is really hard to get at, right? This could be an officer who uses the N-word against everyone he's ever come in contact with, and you're never going to know that. So California still has a really, really long way to go in terms of opening up these records so that, if you actually get to trial, the jurors know what they're dealing with, or the prosecutors. Now, the prosecutors can't technically get access to that information either, but they don't want it. I mean, I gotta say, for the most part, they don't want to know. I had a case once. It is so rare that you can actually demonstrate without the use of video police misconduct, where you can catch officers, for instance, in a lie. I had a preliminary hearing once with an attempted murder case with a gang allegation. It was a life case where somebody had shot at the home of a gang member, and the cops arrested my client, who was apparently high up in the rival gang. And they found a witness, an independent witness, no connection with anything, who lived nearby, who identified my client in a 6-pack. So the cops brought her in. Apparently, according to their report, they kind of pulled out some likely suspects, gave her admonition, told her everything you're supposed to say with a 6-pack, may or may not be here, et cetera, right? And here she pointed out my client. So we get to the preliminary hearing, and they put her on the stand to identify my client. And so when the prosecutor asked her a question, like, do you recognize this person? She said something like, yeah, that's the person I picked out of the six-pack. I was like, gosh, that's an odd thing to say. That's an odd way to phrase it. And so rather than asking the questions I was going to ask her about, her ability to proceed, et cetera, I went straight to the six-pack and I said, can you walk me through how this six-pack process went? It turned out they showed her a six-pack. She couldn't identify anyone. So they took a photo, and I think this was all on audio, but not video. So they took a photo and they set it down in front of her, and it was a large photo of one of the people in the six-pack, which was my client, right? They set down this photo and then take it away. And they say, can you identify anyone? And so she pointed to the person that they told her to point to. And the only reason that ever came out was because she was just a completely honest civilian who believed she was doing the right thing when she identified who the cops told her to, right? And then told the truth when she was on the stand. But the most amazing part about all of it was, in the end, nobody cared. The judge didn't care. The prosecutor didn't care. Nothing happened to those police officers. It was just not, my client was held over to trial. And so even when instances of misconduct are demonstrated, which is so hard to do, right? Never got a response. So now we have body cameras, right? Which is a really helpful thing, right? Because you can actually, in instances, see that what the officers wrote in the report is not what happened. The problem with the body cameras is twofold. The first is you don't get the information immediately. And so when you have someone sitting in custody who has the opportunity to plead guilty to get out of custody, right? They can't afford bail. And the only way to get out of custody is to plead guilty. They're not going to sit around and wait for the body camera footage, which
even if they even if they know the body camera footage would vindicate them,
sure,
they don't want to waste they don't want to sit there for how long. And so they'll just give up the fact that there's a way to actually prove their case just because of how cumbersome the process is.
Right. If they have, if you're facing years and years in prison, then, you sit and you wait for the body camera footage because you're not getting out. Or if you're out of custody, if you're able to post bail, you can sit and wait. Right. But if
there's
you are
inequality right there.
What?
So that's one of the ways that it's like, if you could post bail right away, you could get the evidence from the body cam footage. And if you can't, then you're sitting there. And so that's just like another way that inequality plays out.
And and if you're offered time served, right, it's probably something petty, a misdemeanor, a low-level felony, right? And now there's your record. Right.
And that affects obviously job prospects and a whole host of other things down the line. It's a total way to shatter someone's life. What about sort of reforms in California? I'm wondering, like, how have you seen the impact of, let's say, the repeal of the 3 strikes law? Has that made a difference on the ground, or is that sort of like a way to paper over bigger structural problems?
In terms of sentencing reforms specifically?
Yeah.
So sentencing reforms are important. They are significant, but they are, I think they don't, in LA, they have not had the support of the district attorney's office behind them. And every reform has been fought tooth and nail, in my experience. So examples I could give you, so 3 strikes, for instance, it is certainly a better situation. So the 3 strikes law was, if you had 2 serious or violent felonies on your record, what are considered serious or violent in California, the third one, the third felony, any kind of felony, you would get life in prison. And the kinds of things that would give you life in prison were like possession of drugs, which now, after sentencing reform, not only wouldn't give you life in prison, but it's a misdemeanor. So that's really good. But there are a few categories of people where this this has not solved the problem. So for instance, the people that are incarcerated now based on the 3 strikes law where they wouldn't be eligible or are already where if they were charged now, they wouldn't be eligible. So there's this whole process of going through the people who are incarcerated on a non-serious or violent felony and whether they can be released. And so I had a client who had gotten life on a case of receiving stolen property. He was found with stolen property in his car. And the reason he got life was he had 2 prior serious felonies. Those serious felonies were residential burglaries, nobody home, but, and in fact, specifically nobody home. I mean, he was a drug addict, this was nonviolent, he knocked on doors, no one was there, went in and, you know, stole TV, jewelry, whatever, to pay for his drug habit, which of course he developed as a kid because his parents used drugs and, you know, all of the other reasons we know why people end up right where they are. So, so here he was with nothing violent on his record, and he went to prison for life at about 24 years old. And while in prison, he has not been able to get clean because there is no real drug rehabilitation in prison, especially the prison that he's at. And so over the years, he would test dirty for drugs or be found with a syringe. And so when the 3 strikes reform passed and I got his case and we said, okay, let's try and get you out of here, we had to come up with a plan to convince the judge that he's not dangerous. Now remember, he had never done anything violent, but he was an addict. And he had lots of family members who had been addicts. And in fact, every one of them had gotten clean. And so we got him hooked up with a program that his sister had been in. He had incredible support. And so we presented this plan to the judge and the prosecutors fought it like crazy. And so we had to have a hearing. And in the end, the judge decided that he couldn't release him because he was still using drugs. So he was going to have to spend the rest of his life in prison.
So there's a way in which this system is not really obviously looking towards rehabilitation, but is really looking to sort of just kind of entrench the problem and make and criminalize addiction even, it sounds like.
I blame the judges are at fault a lot, but the prosecutors have a huge role, right? Because the cops, nothing we can do about. I mean, it's a different question, right? But the prosecutors are the ones where, you know, the buck is supposed to stop with them, and they're going to do justice. But if they don't care about reforming, you know, all sorts of lip service
on a broad, they should be able to have discretion to sort
of.
They
have discretion. A mentally ill client of mine who was 19 years old, all this lip service to we are not going to criminalize mental illness. She had a schizophrenic break and she beat up a girl and took her cell phone. And when she was caught, after she had fallen into a manhole, she was telling the police that girl needed to be arrested because she had been following her and taking pictures of her and videotaping her. I mean, it was so clear how ill she was. And she was in no record, 19 years old, in a community college, and she was so sick that she was incompetent. I couldn't even have a conversation with her. She sat in jail for 9 months so they could try and medicate her in an in-jail state hospital. And they came out, and when she came out, the prosecutor said, oh, good, well, she can plead to a robbery. That is a felony strike. It means anything that happens to her in her life, penalties can be doubled, added on, all sorts of stuff. Talk about ruining your job prospects. And so I said, this is nonsense. Like, your boss says you care about not criminalizing mental illness. And when I went above his head, it was even worse. I was told that we need to warehouse mentally ill people. We need a place to warehouse them. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's devastating. That's sort of the mindset that I can't imagine what it's like to come across that mindset and have to sort of sit with that. I hope we'll get back a little bit into more of what you see and as we get to questions. But I just want to bring Becki in because in a lot of ways Becki's research sort of looks at that same problem and sort of looks at how to reframe this as a public health issue rather than criminalizing these same problems. So Becki, do you want to talk a little bit about your thesis that you just finished at Brown?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm in a fascinating time right now, as I think we kind of all are, of seeing some really massive change that has just kind of causing, I think, so many of us to step back and really listen to the voices of youth activists and leaders that have been taking to the streets and demanding some real structural change right now to the ways we imagine public safety and public health and the structural racism that is currently inherent in our system of public safety and many other institutions. So that said, my research, which I started a year ago, looked into pre-arrest diversion programs for youth. So these programs, and so I guess before I dive into like what that is and what that looks like, to respond to sort of what Adam was saying, the idea is that we have to stop bringing so many young people, especially young people of color, or driving young people into the justice system, and really looking, while we've seen so many reforms and we've seen youth incarceration rates fall, we've seen prisons close down, thousands of youth, especially youth of color, come in contact with police and are arrested each year. And this poses serious negative impacts on these young people's life trajectories. And I think Lara really showed a lot of that. So my research looked at, okay, how can we change, have agencies come together so that police no longer arrest young people and instead refer them to community-based resources. And in the process of diversion, schools, community centers, and other sort of community-based intervention points can also create referral pathways to coordinated and community-based public health resources for youth and families, because we know that so many of the underlying factors have so much more to do with, as Elliot mentioned, histories of structural poverty and structural racism. So I think these programs bring to light a lot of really fascinating lessons about what it takes to bring agencies together and prevent youth from being pushed into the justice system, and instead build capacity and coordinate the public health resources that exist in cities and counties and even at the state level. And then all of that said, this time and the advances of these really youth of color led movements we're seeing today have really pushed me to rethink my research, and have pushed, I think, the whole nation into a time when we can really think beyond police reform, confront the fact that the role of police in communities has been to structurally mediate physical and psychological violence upon Black and Brown communities, and question, and really change, okay, so what does public safety look like? And then I have a lot more to say in terms of what could possibly the next steps be in this state. I like this idea of reimagining. I don't know if that's
great.
kind of, yeah. I don't know if
let's sort of get to that in just one second. But before we jump to that would be great. I wonder if you could just kind of talk about, maybe one or two briefly of the most interesting or important lessons you learned in these kind of programs that stop people from finding themselves in the criminal justice system. Like, what were some lessons that you still sort of take with you, or that you think were important in sort of the direction you're going now?
Yeah, so there was, I would say, really 4 salient findings that came out. One was that in order for pre-arrest diversion to work, law enforcement executives have to really be committed to this change and make partnerships to make it happen. And this is part of the reason that moving beyond diversion was kind of difficult conceptually for me. In interviews with officials at the Providence Police Department, many were really asking for a diversion program. They were saying, we know that we are not equipped to respond to these young people, and that we would love another way to connect them to community-based supports. And I think what this time is showing is that that's true. Law enforcement are not equipped to respond to young people. And in fact, we shouldn't really necessarily be focusing on building out connections with law enforcement and community partners. We should be working on reducing the scope of law enforcement intervention and helping young people connect to those community-based supports through community-driven means, mental health first responders, their schools, etc. So that was one finding. Another finding was that some of these programs, I think this is one of the most hopeful things, really created a space for powerful community voice and leadership. And I think we're in a time right now where it's so grassroots. The venue of change is really happening with youth. It's happening at the grassroots, and it's contesting the institutional structures that we had previously used to create policy. It's contesting our institutions of public safety and public health. And so, for instance, in Los Angeles, there was a youth diversion and development program that really brought in young people as true decision makers alongside lots of different institutional leaders. And I think this kind of example, and what that demanded was also to have researchers, public health researchers at the table to create sort of a common language of racial justice, health equity, and center the voices of these youth activists. I think this example in Los Angeles is interesting, and I think we should still be thinking, how can we bring community voices into a space, how can demand that they have true power, and also how married are we to those institutional spaces for policymaking themselves? What does it look like just that the whole process is something I think we need to rethink, and especially the process of budgeting, contracting, who can receive money, because we know that a lot of these solutions are very grassroots and might not be able to sustain traditional budgetary funding structures.
And what's one of the ways that you think might be helpful for us to start thinking about rethinking these structures that we've just relied on for so long? Like, what would be one sort of thing that you would want to, or that you were thinking about starting to challenge?
Yeah. So I think when we think about reimagining, and I think it's also in large part going to come from youth, but right now we're already seeing that young people are sitting down with our politicians and our leaders, but that these changes cannot happen behind closed doors. And when we're talking about, right, there's a movement, I think we have to be explicit, when we're talking about taking, defunding police and really changing the role that police play in society and dramatically reducing the role that police play in society, and then reinvesting funding or investing in the first place, and then also creating alternative forms of public safety. That is where I think we need sort of like new forms of community voice at municipal and state levels, where we can't just rely on the nonprofit industrial complex. We can't just rely on our child welfare agencies that we know for too long have also separated Black and brown families, surveilled, in some senses even criminalized Black and brown families, and really hear from community members what are the resources in their own communities, what are, you know, often small grassroots groups that don't have the capacity to apply for federal, state level funding, or to report the reporting that those contracts and funding demands, so that we can get those real community ideas on the table. You know, where should we put this money? Is it into a public housing authority, or is it into another type of community-based housing? Because public housing authorities can often also collaborate with law enforcement, also surveil communities, have long wait lists. So it's these types of nuances that we can't, as we're building something new, that it must really be community-led and community-driven. I think in Providence, we're seeing a really interesting moment where a lot of the researchers and institutions are actually really hanging back to listen. I was just spoke with someone at the Vera Institute, and she really said, I think it's a real time for us to sit with uncertainty and listen to the voices of these grassroots organizers as we seriously consider how do we change our processes of policymaking to center these voices and change the ways we allocate resources.
It's fascinating because obviously these questions are being raised, you know, more and more. And now the question is really, is this conversation going to be sustainable in the long run? But yeah, thank you for laying that out, and to Lara and Elliot for an excellent jumping off point today. So I think what we'll do now is break out into small groups for a few minutes and sort of just reflect on what we heard, what was new, what was surprising, what was challenging, or what we're thinking about going forward. And maybe if everyone could kind of, in these groups, introduce themselves, where they're zooming from, and come up with somebody to ask a question from the group to put to our panelists. And we'll try to get, you know, at least a couple questions in. So let's spend just a few minutes doing that now. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Sorry to rudely interrupt what I'm sure we're fascinating discussions. So in the interest of time, as you're coming back into the room, we'll try to get at least 2 questions in. So if someone wants to be brave and jump in right away with a question, that would be great. Just kind of shout out a question.
Well, Becki, I had the pleasure of meeting your grandparents in Augusta, Georgia. That was nice. So the question I brought, and maybe Lara's in the best, but any of you might have some sense this bill that's being proposed by Republicans in the Senate. First of all, it's amazing to me that there's a response even of the Republicans, that I guess Senator Tim Scott, the one African-American Republican senator, has kind of pulled together. I'm not sure of all the details of it, but from what you heard, does it sound like it would make any difference? Would it move things in a slightly positive direction?
I'm actually not familiar with it. I'm not sure.
I think it includes, well, maybe somebody else is more familiar with it.
Well, some of it is incentivizing police to not use chokeholds rather than making chokeholds illegal. But they're not touching qualified immunity. And so I'm not sure if anyone else knows about what the other.
But also some sort of public record of police officers who.
I think that's right. I'm not sure
have a long record of misbehavior or something.
So maybe the question is more generally how important. I mean, we saw that in New York as well, and we'll be talking about that tomorrow. But maybe Larry, if it is sort of, do you want to talk about the public records of police and how important that is? Would that be?
Yeah, it sounded like some of the things that Lara was talking about that would make a difference.
Yeah, I will say, the one thing I will say is that there has been, the advent of body cameras has not appeared to change police behavior.
Wow.
I don't know that public records will change police behavior. I don't know that any of that can change what is just so deeply ingrained in policing in this country. I think that it could be the case that it could impact prosecutor decisions, but I have yet to see that. Now, there are places where progressive prosecutors are in place, and maybe those experiences are different, but someone, you know, once this stuff comes out, someone has to care about it. And the problem with, you know, average people like jurors is, first of all, the case has to get there, right? So the person has to be willing to wait to trial. And by the way, in the middle of COVID-19, nobody's having a trial, right? And then number two, you know, the minute you express as a juror any kind of hesitancy about the police, you get kicked. So the only people who are left now, right, because who doesn't have hesitancy about police, right? So I don't know that this is going to really change anything.
Yeah.
You're right.
Let's try to get, just because we're short on time, if there's one more question, if someone wants to jump in with a question from your group, that would be great.
I'll ask. This is for Lara. Our prosecutor is pressured to reach a quota. Are stats driving their decisions?
It's a good question. So as far as I know, there are no official quotas or stats for the prosecutors, but there is internal pressure. In Los Angeles, it is very difficult to be a prosecutor trying to do the right thing, because you don't get the thumbs up for going easy on anyone, and that is also a culture thing. Now, I think the culture of a prosecutor's office might be easier to shift than the culture of a police department. But like, I gotta tell you, I'm sorry, you know, in the midst of right now, in the midst of everything, a couple of things have been happening that have just been blowing my mind. Number one, 18 and 19-year-old Black kids with no record are charged with looting, meaning going in somewhere, you know, when somebody has vandalized, lit it on fire, broke whatever, taken something, right? They are arrested and not released, and they can't post bail, and they are pleading guilty. And so in the midst of all of this, the prosecutor's office has no problem, you know, putting criminal records on these 18 and 19-year-old Black kids, number one. Number two, just the other day, I mean, this was like 2 days ago, a colleague of mine got a case where two people broke into an unoccupied home to go to sleep and take a shower, which they hadn't even done yet. They hadn't even taken the shower. And the prosecutor's office charged them. The cops arrested them for residential burglary, breaking and entering with intent to steal something, i.e. water. And the prosecutors charged them, and based on their record, there is no offer. They are facing life in prison in this climate right now for going to sleep in a house because they're homeless. I mean,
It's hard to make sense of, yeah.
It's hard to, right. But so no to the quotas, but yes to the culture.
Yeah, and that's pervasive and hard to change. Let's do actually one more question, and this is, and maybe we can actually get everyone to weigh in on this very quickly. Noah, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I guess so. Like building on that bit of cynicism from Lara, I've got a pile of my own cynicism to bring. So I'm a historian, and I work in a criminal justice related nonprofit, and I guess I'm curious what your sense is about the possibility of this moment sparking structural change in a way that like other similar moments really like have disappointed, right? Like I know I was at a university during Ferguson, and you know we had a big show of listening, and then nothing changed. We've all had the diversity consultants assign things like white fragility 1,000 times before. Is there something that makes this moment different? How is this night different from all other nights?
Do we want to work? Maybe we'll start with Elliot and go to Lara and Becki. We'll go back in order. It'd be great to get your
hi Noah, amazing question. And I'm still processing, the story that Lara just told, but myself, I'm optimistic. I think there's a long history of abolitionist thought in America, from Garrison to Ida B. Wells to Pauline Murray, and I think people are getting tapped into that. I'm excited about it. I'm optimistic to see some real change in criminal justice.
Yeah, I'll say, as cynical as I am, I think, first of all, right, Brian Stevenson says hope is the enemy of injustice, so you got to keep hoping, even though a lot of times I don't feel like that. But the other thing I will say is, in Los Angeles, the mayor has already committed to some defunding of the police, and also has walked back his endorsement of the current district attorney. So what those things indicate to me is that there is political pressure, perhaps, that has not been there in the past. And maybe it's just because of COVID, and people can't work and they can't do anything else, and so they're not giving up and they're not letting it go. But at least maybe this can be an inflection point, and maybe there's going to be a response.
I agree. Arundhati Roy says the pandemic is a portal between the current world and the next that will be created. The just incredible force and vigor of youth organizing across the nation, I think, sort of brings to light that, we're not really equipped. Many of us who've worked in our institutions themselves, as they are currently structured or as they currently operate, may not be equipped to fully take on structural racism to the extent that the moment demands, and that it would have to be new processes. It can't just be sort of new shifts of funding, but it needs to be new processes of budgetary decisions, policymaking, and program development that the very young people at the forefront of these movements are best equipped to take the lead in and design and demand, whether the extent to which the policy window closes, and not just the policy window for changing the role of police, but the policy window for changing the way we make these decisions as a society. I think that's not even necessarily a window. I think that these movements are sort of demanding deeper, more profound change, and this kind of change, as we've seen, also in history and revolutions across countries, right, has always been led by young people who can really are picturing something beyond the current structures that exist. And just in general, the words abolition just, were radical only a few weeks ago and are now rather commonplace. So I think the nation's mind is definitely the collective consciousness, while very divided. Maybe that's the wrong word to use. I'm sorry. That a consciousness has definitely been shifted by these movements and voices of youth activists, youth of color who are leading them.
What an amazing place to conclude, and I just want to thank again Becki and Lara and Elliot for bringing such fascinating insight to our conversation today, and such a sobering look at at their different work. We're going to continue this conversation tomorrow. We'll be looking at prosecutorial reform and reentry and sort of other diversion programs that happen on that are post sort of arrest. So it'll be a fascinating conversation again at 2 o'clock. So once again, thank you to all our panelists, and thank you to everyone for joining today.
Thank you.